Okay. So I'd like to open with a quote from Rosabeth Moss Cantor. She wrote, "A vision is not just a picture of what could be. It is an appeal to our better selves, a call to become something more." In this society for ethical culture, we honor both personal growth and social change. The intersection of those two comes with a challenge. How do we each need to take personal action that moves the world towards social justice? How do we work for social change that moves the world towards the kind of world in which every human being can develop and grow towards their human potential, what we here in shorthand call the best? Ethical vision is an important piece of making sense of all of this. We need to know what kind of world we want if we are to act to move us toward it. We need a vision that moves us, motivates us, even compels us toward action if we are to have the passion to act. So ethical vision is not just an idea of what kind of world we want. It's a compelling vision, one that calls people to responsibility. That vision is all the more important when we see violations of that vision around us. The violations, ironically, can sometimes help us see our vision even more clearly and know what to do, what needs to be done. In Western religions, this kind of vision has often been called prophetic witness. When I think of being prophetic and what that means to us as ethical humanists, what I mean is that we stand in a long tradition of individuals and communities, calling the community away from injury, away from injustice, away from apathy, away from despair, and towards a vision. The term prophetic is one that has multiple meanings. Sometimes it means foretelling a future, a kind of prediction. The word vision can also have a meaning of seeing or hearing something outside of the natural world, as in having visions. Within religious traditions, as well as some secular uses, prophetic also has another meaning, truth-telling. And in particular, a kind of truth-telling that calls people to responsibility towards a vision of the future. We are used to the term vision or visions having that kind of dual meaning. Prophetic is the same. And in particular, the term prophetic vision has often been used to multiply and reinforce the idea of a vision of the future that calls out to us. In some traditions, divine inspiration is believed to be behind that prophetic vision. In others, it's human imagination. In others, it's something in between, something about catching the vision that seems to be given to us. The skeptic might say that it is always human imagination, and the more traditional might say that it is always supernaturally inspired, but the effect is the same. Vision matters, and calling us towards a vision matters. We cannot change the world to make it more ethical, to make it over in accord with values and ideals without a vision of where we're going. For effective action, we also need to assess well where we are and what strategies will move us from where we are to where we can come closer to fulfilling our vision. Vision, though, prophetic witness, is the foundation stone. Without that, we fail. As the Hebrew scriptures say, without vision, the people perish. In the Native American vision quest, a vision is more than a wish or a dream. It is an image of how an individual will fit into the community, serve the community, and be most fulfilled in serving the community. How an individual will become their best by helping the community become its best. In Judaism, the prophets were those who called the whole community to become its best. In their culture, being the best meant to be loyal to the Word of God and God's vision for humanity rather than to narrow self-interests. Narrow self-interest includes greed, hunger for power, apathy in the face of the greed and power hunger of others. It also includes choosing comfort and short-term safety over joining in the making of change. Prophecy by the prophet Amos, calling for the community to turn away from sacrifices and offerings of grain from focusing merely on sounds of harps, turning instead to action, calling on the community to act according to its deepest values so that justice would roll down like waters and ethical, righteous actions like an ever-flowing stream. Prophecy is Ezekiel, calling on the leaders of Israel to put away violence and destruction and practice justice and righteousness. Prophecy is Jeremiah, quoting his understanding of the divine command, do justice and righteousness, and deliver the one who has been robbed from the power of his oppressor. Also, do not mistreat or do violence to the stranger, the orphan, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place. Prophecy is Hosea, hold fast to love and justice. Biblical scholars have pointed out that righteousness in those writings was about how one treated the poor, those with less power. In Christianity as it developed, prophecy sometimes took on the meaning of foreshadowing, of predicting, but there was still a rootedness in that Hebrew tradition of prophecy. Whether you see all of these stories as legends or biography, there's a power, I think, in hearing about Jesus overthrowing the tables of money changers who had turned the temple, the place where the Jewish people honored their heritage and their highest values, and turned that temple into a financial enterprise. Prophecy in early Christianity is Jesus in the book of Matthew calling this the measure of individual righteousness. How you treat the least of these, the widow who had no means of supporting herself, the stranger, the orphan, the poor, the disabled, the prisoner. Islam has its own prophetic tradition with which we in the West have become less familiar, living by example as well as living by rules. Some quotes from that tradition. You cannot enter heaven until you believe, and you will not truly believe until you truly love one another. And whoever failed to have compassion for our little ones and reverence for our elders and to command what is right and to prohibit what is wrong is not one of us. Some biblical scholars have pointed out that in the Hebrew prophetic times, in the time of Jesus, in the time of Muhammad, one of the major challenges faced was transformation of society into a more urban culture and trying to get people to live by an ethic that worked in denser populations that were also more diverse. You didn't know everyone anymore. You didn't grow up with everyone around you. Well, in the 19th century in America, we had a similar challenge. As we moved from a 90% agrarian population to just after the 20th century began to about 90% urban. In the so-called progressive era in America, as the post-Civil War population struggled with increasing social problems of urbanization, of immigration, of trying to figure out who was included and how to include them. In that time, those on the progressive end came around again to using faith and religion to promote social change. The social gospel, the idea that the Christian idea of heaven and earth, heaven on earth, was what we create here and now, among ourselves, not merely something out there. The beloved community. Progressive Jews and progressive Christians called for community responsibility for social problems. A trend at the same time, traditional belief systems didn't seem relevant any longer for many people, and people began to see religions as plural and not as singular. So you saw groups like the first ethical culture societies begin to form, to focus on, as it says on the outside of the New York Society building, the ever-increasing knowledge, love, and practice of the right. A Unitarian minister, John Dietrich, attached the term humanism to a trend within religion to move away from a strictly theistic view of religion. He said he got the term from a social sense of humanism, what he called human responsibility for human problems. Not an individualistic humanism, but a social humanism. Community responsibility for social problems. human responsibility for human problems. Humanism itself was a kind of social gospel, but without deities or creeds. Humanism was a new branch on that larger prophetic tree, calling people to the ethical higher ground of a world in which all people could thrive. It is this sort of prophetic tradition out of which ethical culture was born. Not just a merely secular, pragmatic political approach to creating better government, better social solutions, but grounding all of that in moral principle, holding some values as sacred, whether traditionally religious or not. Thus we can say the place where all meet to seek the highest is holy ground. Whatever holy ground there is, it isn't about believing the right ideas. Holy ground is what we create when we meet together in solidarity to seek the highest, the moral or ethical high ground. Yes, that progressive generation instituted such reforms as political primaries, rather than just letting parties in cigar smoke-filled rooms select the candidates. Such reforms as civil service, to protect most government workers from political revenge when the parties in power change. Such reforms as the beginning of a social support system, including public education and public welfare. Such reforms as beginning to move toward racial and gender justice, such as figuring out how to welcome the stranger when many from other parts of the world wanted to join us here. However imperfectly all these were implemented, those were considered sacred work, holy work, ethical vision, not just practical politics. In a time when a new president reverses many decades of progressive change, a Congress resurrects pre-Civil War law to essentially make civil service meaningless. In a new time when primaries and general elections are corrupted by fake news and voter suppression and money's increasing role. In a time when the elderly and the poor and the sick are cut off from support. The time in which ethical culture was founded is worth reflecting on. When Felix Adler, not quite 25 years old, was asked to give a talk on his vision for a new movement, one that would unite, as he said, the believer and the infidel in both personal growth and ethical action, back on May 16th, 1876, 140 years ago last year. He might sound prophetic in the sense of foretelling the future in these words, but his intent was to be prophetic in the sense of truth-telling. At a time when the civil service and the primaries were new, Felix Adler said on that day, "We measure our enjoyments by the sum expended. A great crisis sweeps over the land. The sinews of trade are relaxed, the springs of wealth are sealed. Old houses whose foundations seemed as lasting as the hills give way before the storm. Reverse follows reverse." He also said, "But the renovation of our civil service, the reform of our primaries, and whatever other measures may be devised, they all depend in the last instance upon the fidelity of those to whom their execution must be entrusted. They will all fail unless the root of the evil be attacked, unless the conscience of people be aroused, the confusion of right and wrong checked, and the loftier purposes of our being again brought powerfully home to the hearts of the people. More simply, without vision, the people perish. Or at least the dreams of the people will perish. The thriving of an ideal like democracy will perish." Many who are involved in politics right now are fighting a lot of defensive battles. And I use the imagery of war deliberately, because for many that's what this feels like. Strategies are about more than damage control, than moving toward a vision. Daily calls to our Congress beings are not for loftier purposes of our being, but more about say no to this appointee or vote no to this proposal. Sudden calls to go to the airport and demonstrate, or donate to the ACLU, those are damage control. Celebrating a victory when a horrible edict is only temporarily and partially blocked. That's damage control. And it is important to do damage control when we perceive a pushback from our journey towards the highest. You know, even in nonviolent practice, the need is acknowledged for defensive force that is not violent, but is forceful towards persons and groups. Nonviolent practice doesn't mean to be passive. Sometimes seeking the highest first requires a defensive power, resisting those forces that make it difficult to move towards the highest. But focusing only on the negative, on the defensive, on resistance, has long-term the potential to be destructive. It's easier to fall prey to treating others as we are being treated, not as we want to be treated. It's easier to become burned out. It's easy to turn to revenge instead of focusing on our purpose. And here's where the prophetic vision is essential. In other words that have been used secularly but are rooted in religious traditions of prophetic vision, keep your eyes on the prize. Religiously, the prize used to mean heaven, another realm after death. In prophetic vision and action in the world, it has come to mean keep your eyes on that higher moral ground, on the world of justice, righteousness, the peace that comes with justice. Seek the highest. Seek the highest in solidarity with those who are different and create holy ground, moral high ground. Before Felix Adler gave that opening address from which I quoted, he'd been trained as a rabbi. And he'd grown up during the American Civil War, which he forever after saw as a victory over the practice of enslaving some people for the economic benefit of a few. So Adler was quite familiar with and fond of the messages of the Hebrew prophets. As with others in the era of the social gospel, he heard those prophetic voices calling for a new world now, in this world. And he heard them calling for active work to create that world. It quickly became clear that he wasn't going to be called as a rabbi, since his ideas of religion were centered on human community and not the worship of a god. He was sent at 22 to teach Hebrew and Oriental literature at Cornell University, with a grant making such work possible. Oriental literature, as it was called at the time, included the literature of India, since he knew Sanskrit and Pali. In Adler's teaching, he stressed how the ideas in that literature could address modern issues of politics and labor. And because he had those modern ties, it was the end of the grant that paid his salary. And so Adler, with support of many others, focused on founding a new kind of religious movement that would bring people seeking ethical high ground together. Theists and deists, agnostics and freethinkers and atheists, all united around deed, not creed. And yet it was not simply a political movement to make change in the world either. It was to be a religious movement in that it would call on people to reflect on their own behavior as well as that of the powerful in the world, and find ways to change themselves and then to act. And act the community did. The next year, the First Society for Ethical Culture was incorporated, and that year instituted a nursing service to visit the poor, without, as many of the services of the time did, demanding that those poor they served be members of their own religious community. And the following year, the Society founded its school for the children of the working poor. That school from the first provided not only education and a safe place to be during the day, but it actually provided food and needed clothing for the children. From the beginning, the tradition of ethical culture has been to take a wider view of all humanity and take human responsibility for human problems. Now, I grew up in an era in which prophetic vision called many to the active promotion of civil rights and racial justice. Many of the leaders from that movement were inspired by a religious or secular version of an ethical vision, a prophetic vision of the worth of every person and the responsibility of those with and without power to come together for the sake of all. Dr. Martin Luther King, whose birthday America celebrated this month, has been sanctified and sanitized. But his radical vision of justice rolling down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, that vision was not safe and comfortable, nor was the work to move towards that vision. Some who were inspired to follow that prophetic vision died in the pursuit. There's been a backlash that followed some wins. The vision of justice has not been achieved, and indeed much of the progress has been stopped or even reversed by direct and less direct assaults on justice and righteousness. The same can be said for women's rights, another movement that crested in my lifetime and has been experiencing decades of backlash in a newly revived attempt to reverse much that was won. Both the civil rights movement and the women's movement can remind us that this prophetic vision is not an individualistic one. We celebrated King's birthday, and younger people, when they celebrate it, are often taught a story of the civil rights movement that puts King at the top and the center. But he himself resisted that position. He preferred to be considered a drum major, not a general. One of those who helped inspire and keep the movement going, but not the leader, not the sole head of the movement. Rebecca Parker, who was a Methodist minister, headed one of the Unitarian Universalist theological schools for many years, wrote this about the kind of prophets we're talking about today. It is a mistake to see the prophet as an isolated, heroic individual. It is better to see him or her as the crest of a wave. Felix Adler, in some ways, the prophet of ethical culture, wasn't alone in his position in creating this movement. His ideas weren't created out of nothing, though he may have had an inspired way of putting them together. He was the crest of a wave. Martin Luther King Jr. was the crest of a wave, and so was Ella Baker, and so was Bayard Rustin. In winning advances in women's reproductive rights, there were many who rode the crest of the wave. Today's Black Lives Matter movement has deliberately chosen a leadership model that is fluid and shared. Those of us who grew up under a different model may believe that our way is the only way, but I think we need to watch and learn from this new vision, adapted for new times and new challenges. The role of the prophets, the ones with prophetic vision, is to work with others rather than being isolated. Prophets and visionaries are always rooted in a community. That community needs to be called and reminded and urged to act. And at the same time, the community is the container of the values that resonate when the prophet speaks. Prophetic vision isn't about foretelling a future. The one element in prophetic vision is to create an inspired vision and picture of what the world could be if we do act. And sometimes it's to create an image of what the world would be if we don't act. Prophetic vision is more about calling the community to remember its deepest values and to act moving towards those values. To seek the highest together, to move towards the higher ground that the values call us towards in your way of life. Thus, it is a tragic habit we have to sanitize our ethical heroes, those who've been prophetic voices, to make them less threatening, to put their call completely in the past, or to make the call about a return to some imagined or real past in which you and yours were in charge, were the ones in power over others, and the others were not also being included in circles of power and justice. Calling for being great again and turning back from what actually could make for greatness. Palmer goes on to add, remember that all the great prophets were courageous and outrageous folks who railed against the powers that be, challenged self-satisfied piosity, threatened the prevailing social order, and would find you falling short in some significant way. I would add, and even the greatest prophetic voices were real people who themselves fell short in some significant ways. If a voice is calling merely for comfort, that's not a prophetic voice. And so being a prophetic voice, a voice for ethical vision, is often itself uncomfortable. Noam Chomsky pointed out this: the ones we call the prophets were the ones jailed and driven into the desert. Being a prophetic voice is often uncomfortable, even dangerous, and prophetic vision, ethical vision, is even more called for in times when it seems like we're in an ethical desert where there's risk in acting. Another writer who has often inspired me, James Luther Adams, wrote about communities like ethical societies being prophetic communities. He described such a community as one in which, quote, all members share the common responsibility to attempt to foresee the consequences of human behavior, both individual and institutional, with the intention of making history in place of merely being pushed around by it. Only through the prophetism of all its members can we together foresee doom and mend our common ways, unquote. He's pointed out in this quote two important factors of ethical vision. One, that it is a community responsibility to have that vision and keep it, and that we can and indeed should all become practitioners of ethical vision. And second, that prophetic vision is about action, not passive foreseeing. Whatever foreseeing there is about seeing clearly with our imaginations what will happen if we don't change, and then caring enough to change. Sanitizing prophets and ethical heroes, expecting the work of ethical and prophetic vision to be easy, assuming that it's a job for a few special people and not all of us, or assuming that progress and history are inevitable. Those are all tragic errors. So what would it mean today to have this be a community of ethical vision? It means we would listen to voices who challenge us. Felix Adler's prophetic vision for society, for ethical culture, includes a radical inclusion of who is here and a promotion of action to make the world out there more inclusive and more just. As a cornerstone on that first building says, the ethical community is one that is dedicated to the ever-increasing knowledge, love, and practice of the right. If you're here because you think this is a place for ethical people to gather and talk about how other people need to act differently, you're either going to be disappointed or maybe you'll be inspired to learn a different way. Here, if we are at our most authentic and best as a society for cultivating ethics, we are people who know that we need to grow and change and act if the world is going to be more ethical. This community is about inspiring us, but the society is not just about us. We're neither a political action group nor a social community, but a community of individuals who know that the personal and the political are interconnected. We as a community at our ethical best support each other, not just in our personal journeys, but in working to make a more ethical world. We are about creating and sustaining the energy of the wave, even when it's ebbing and far from cresting. We are about being part of that wave, making it crest again. We are a community at our ethical best that seeks the highest, rather than assuming that we've already found it. We know that it's not always safe to be prophetic, and so being a community of ethical vision means to manage risk rather than to avoid risk. We are a community at our ethical best that knows that sacred ground, whatever that means to you, is created by mutual visioning. We can learn from each other, challenge each other, and change and evolve our own visions. We are a community at our ethical best that recognizes that vision is about truth-telling, that the best way to predict the future is to imagine and describe it in such a way that our ethical vision creates a passion that moves us to want to create that future, inspires us to put our hearts and hands and feet into creating that future. Prophetic and ethical vision is about making history, not about being pushed around by history. Now, I had planned for this topic many months ago when I did not predict the world that we are today facing, dismantling much of what we consider progress, potential damage that may take decades to heal, the renormalization of exclusion and bigotry that were at least generally considered embarrassing. But an ethical vision, a prophetic vision, begins with the recognition that there is a different world we can imagine and keeping our eyes on that prize. One of Felix Adler's most challenging ideas is that we are often most aware of our visions, our ideals, when we fail to reach them. The more dramatic the failure, the more vividly we experience what our ideals are. Whatever else we have learned from this new transition of power in our country, it's that we aren't very good at knowing what those who differ from us are thinking. I think it also means that without a clear vision of the future, fear will become the motivator of action and decision. Fear may even move us towards a past that is imagined to be more positive than the present, when it demonstrably was not better for most people. One writer says that for groups like ours that are not traditionally religious, the prophetic message is not repent. The prophetic message is wake up. Yes, there's regret for what we have and haven't done, for how our actions and inactions may have caused pain and played into injustice. And there's repair work to do. But the prophetic message itself is to wake up and get out of our metaphorical beds and get active. We still want a world where justice flows freely. We still want to challenge patterns of social and political abuse by the many to preserve comfort of a few. We still need the power of community so that voices who speak are crests of the wave and not isolated individuals. I think we are called in this time, even more than I imagined we would be, to be a prophetic community. We need to look for the roots of what compels some to move further away from the kind of world in which wider and wider circles of people are considered of worth and value. We need to check the confusion of truth and fiction. We need to arouse consciences and bring powerfully home to the hearts of people the ideals of justice, of human worth, of human connectedness. We are, if we choose, not mere puppets or victims of history and politics, but agents of change, motivated by vision and informed by listening and reflection. Whenever this is hard, we can support each other. In a month of many holidays that we may be tempted to use them, of so many holidays that we may be tempted to use them as merely days of personal comfort, we do need rest and recuperation, that's true, but we may also use this month to recommit ourselves to seeking together for ethical vision and then to actions that will bring life to that vision. Well, I've mused today on how we get to the future by considering some voices of the past as well. So I'm going to close with some other words from that first address of Felix Adler's. The past speaks to us in 1,000 voices, warning and comforting, animating and stirring to action. What its great thinkers have thought and written on the deepest problems of life shall we not hear and enjoy. But then he adds, the future calls upon us to prepare its way. Dare we fail to answer its solemn summons. Thank you.